Hello everybody, here's another podcast in the series of Kittens and Dragons. Today I'm going to take a look at Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 2nd edition. Now, this is a game that is very, very old. You can still get it though, and you can still get really good copies off of Dungeon Masters Guild or RPG Drive-Thru, or Drive-Thru RPG rather. Even as print on demand, at least the Player's Guide and the Monster Manual of the premium edition of AD&D 2nd edition are available. The Dungeon Master's Guide isn't. I've not been able to determine why that is. It's a pity because I'm a completionist and when I start buying books I want to have them all, and I also don't do PDFs. I don't like reading off of a computer screen. So in order for me to get all books as hard copies, I had to search high and low because not only are they now out of print, as I said, probably a lot of them have been thrown onto the trash heap of history because either people who got them as children game no longer, or they have moved on to other editions of 5e, or maybe even moved to completely different systems, but wouldn't have held on to them. And so there are very, very few in circulation, at least here in Europe. The situation may be very different in the United States, I don't know. But I managed to get a copy from World of Books, WOB, as they have now rebranded themselves. It's a used copy. It is in quite good nick, but of course, since the printing was done on very cheap paper, the paper is now quite yellow, but it basically lends a lot of nostalgia to it, especially since there is a little dedication at the front of the book to the person who owned it. So it's and to me, this is always a really interesting idea to think about. Okay, so this person got this book on such and such a date or in such and such a year. I wonder where are they now? I wonder, are they still playing? I will never know, but if somebody is wondering what happened to their black edition of the Dungeon Master's Guide of AD&D, which they might have sold to charity or something, I own it now, and it's in my bookshelf, and it's getting a lot of TLC. So, AD&D 2nd edition, the book that I am basing this on was first released in 1989. However, there was kind of like a premium edition that came out in 1995, but according to the foreword by Steve Winter, dated February 6th, 1995, there is no change to the rules themselves. The contents of the book are the same. I understand, and I have no way of confirming this, that in the previous version, the artwork was different. I can only say that I heard that most of the art was done by Larry Elmore, whereas the the premium edition used different and other artists. Having said this, the art is kind of hit and miss in this one. But talking about art and D&D is a completely different kettle of fish, and I would like to refer you all to Esper the Bard, who has done 2 comparison videos for art across the different editions of D&D, and I find it highly interesting, and it's very recommended that you watch this. Now, what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to go through every single page of this book. I'm also not going to explain the rules. But I have read quite a lot of different rule books of different systems. I've played a lot of different systems. And I think that everyone who has ever played role-playing games sooner or later got to the point where they said, this rule isn't working for my group. We want to do this differently, blah, 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 blah. And I think most people actually have some sort of homebrew going. If it's that they say certain character classes are not allowed, or certain races are not allowed, or certain feats are not allowed, blah, 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 because you find them game breaking, or you believe that maybe in the place that you're playing in, a tiefling or a dragonborn simply wouldn't fit because these races don't exist. So if you want to play in this universe, you can't be that race, or where you say maybe there are no humans, you know. And So I like reading different rule sets and also thinking about what does this rule set do really, really well? Is this something that I would like to adapt? Are there things that we now think are standard, but they were maybe just being introduced in that particular edition of this rule set, and you can slowly see how they are emerging. So that's really what I look at when I read, even especially old versions of books. So when I read the Dungeon Master's Guide, what I found and what struck me most was that I got the feeling that they are trying to prep the Dungeon Master for an almost adversary relationship with the players. They mention that players will try to break the game. It's important to make sure that they adhere to all of the rules so as not to run roughshod over the campaign that you as the DM have created. And that really struck me. The reason why this struck me was because I think it kind of shows a couple of things. Number one, probably way back when, games were always considered a game of opposition. You play against someone else. And of course we have to remember that D&D originates from wargaming. And there is a very interesting film about Arneson, Dave Arneson, where they actually talk about different types of war games, and they say that most war games are a zero-sum game. So basically, one side loses, and then another side has to win. So at the end of the game, there is a zero sum. So some people have a minus, some people have a plus, but they basically, when you add them up together, you get to zero. That is the usual thing in a war game, and I know this myself because I've played plenty, or even in normal games that we play, like parlor games, like Clue, like Game of Life, Monopoly. Whenever you play, somebody wins and somebody loses. And then they came up with Brownstein, and I'm not going to go into any details. It's a very interesting game, so watch the video, watch the movie. But there, they came up with the idea that the players have different objectives, but they can reach their objectives without negating somebody else being able to reach their objectives. So instead of having a zero-sum game where player A, B, and C win and D, E, and F have to lose in order for A, B, and C to win, A, B, C, D, E, F could all win, and still the game would come to a conclusion. And I'm not saying that this is like, oh yeah, now we don't have first, second, third place, and then you have a fourth winner and a fifth winner, blah, blah, blah. This is not what this is about. It's not about everyone's a winner, but it's competing interests where the idea is to come together and possibly find ways of compromising, of diplomatic interactions to say, okay, I need to achieve this, you need to achieve this. We don't really follow the same goal because we all have different things that we want to achieve, but can we band together against the situation that we're in and try to get through the both of us and not just one of us? And then, of course, the other thing is that at the time, and I think it's different today, at least in Germany, because a lot of role players today are actually older because they grew up with the hobby and are now in their 40s, 50s, some even 60s. But I believe it's true to say that the first editions of D&D, whichever, if it's D&D 0, D&D 1, AD&D, were aimed at a male group of players aged 10 to 18. I know that for a fact in the DSA, Das Schwarze Auge, the Dark Eye, everyone who wrote for them was told your target audience is male players between 10 and 18. And of course, a lot of the stuff that was churned out addresses this market niche with all of the shortcomings you can imagine. So forget about diversity and forget about, certain things that you would find in an older age group. So basically you have this, on the one hand, this legacy of wargaming, zero-sum games, but also this idea that the people who are playing are basically going to be contentious. They want contest. They want to be challenged. And when you look at the very old modules, and I mean, I think this goes on for a long time in D&D as well, it's basically dungeon crawls. So the idea is the dungeon master sits down and they just create dungeons. That's what they do. And I mean, Tomb of Horrors is one of those. You know, you have all of those, and you know, really look at retro clones of all of those games. It is somebody sitting down creating a dungeon, which is essentially a series of challenges. It can be traps, it can be riddles, it can be puzzles, it can be monsters. But the idea is that the dungeon master is basically the spider at the center of the web, sitting on the treasure, and you guys are trying to come in and fight your way to the center of the dungeon, kill whatever is in your way, overcome all of the problems, and then take away the treasure. And so there is this adversary relationship. And basically, I got the feeling when I read the Dungeon Master's Guide that a lot of advice was about, you know, your players are going to try to get one over on you, blah, 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 blah. So here is how you avoid this. Which in my group is completely different, or in any of the groups that I have played, and this has never been a problem. It was always about telling a story. And of course, this could be because a cultural difference occurred, although I don't think that this would have been to do with where you're from, but I think it may be that the people that I would game with are a lot more focused on storytelling. That doesn't mean that we're not interested in mechanics, and I, for one, love miniature combat, but the cultural difference is that you don't see this as going in, fighting something, coming out again, which can be fun, but that it's all about the character and the world that they live in and how they interact with what's thrown at them. And for us, the Dungeon Master is, yes, the storyteller. We also use the word storyteller quite often. But they are kind of, in a way, the hand of fate. And I, as a Dungeon Master, like rolling as well. So I roll dice quite a lot because I want to see what fate is telling me. What fate is telling me about my own story. And I think when I look at the modern version of D&D, the one that's current at the moment, 5e, and you read the Dungeon Master's Guide, this is pretty much at the heart of the game today. So this whole idea of, oh yeah, and they're going to run roughshod over units, all going to be terrible, and you have to keep them in check, you know, that's no longer there. And interestingly enough, in the very old days, there wasn't a dungeon master. It was called a referee. And a referee is, of course, somebody who really basically sits there and says, yes, you're right, you're wrong, that's a penalty, you have to go into the sin bin and whatnot, blah, blah, blah. So that was the first thing that struck me. Mechanically speaking, those of you who have ever played one of the old AD&D based computer games will maybe remember a couple of things. They're deadly. So basically in AD&D, when you die, when you hit 0 hit points, you're dead. Which is why in the campaign setting Dark Sun, which is very deadly, they say, okay, well, first of all, everybody starts at 3rd level. Secondly, think about having the minus 10 hit point rule. So instead of saying when you hit 0 hit points, you're dead, when you hit 0 hit points, are still alive, but you're slowly bleeding out and you're losing hit points over time, unless somebody comes and stabilizes you, in which case you don't resurrect, you don't come back and back to life, let's say in this particular combat round or in this particular combat turn, but you're at least not dying. So you find this today because you do the death saving throws, and if somebody stabilizes you, then everything's fine. Then, of course, there is also the interesting point that different races have a class limit when it comes to levels, and also a limit as to which class they can actually take part in. So those race, class, and level limits are as follows. Dwarves can only be clerics, fighters, and thieves. They can be up to a 10th level cleric, up to a 15th level fighter, and up to a 12th level thief. Elves can become clerics, fighters, mages, rangers, and thieves, but they're capped at 12 for cleric, fighter, and thief, and 15 for mage and ranger. The gnome can be a 9th level cleric, up to an 11th level fighter, up to a 15th level illusionist, and up to a 13th level thief. The half-elf can be an unlimited level of bard, cleric 14, druid 9, fighter 14, mage 12, Ranger 16 and Thief 12. The Halfling can be an 8th level cleric, up to a 9th level fighter, up to a 15th level thief, and humans can be all classes and all levels. So it's quite interesting to see how restrictive this was, and basically that halflings and dwarves can be clerics, as can be gnomes and elves and half-elves, but bards are restricted to half-elves. That's a very interesting thing, except of course if you're a human. So that was something that I realized way back when I was playing. I thought this was odd. Also, of course, you have the prerequisites that if you want to become a certain class, you have to have certain starting values during character creation when you generate them. And we will actually be generating a Dark Sun character live, so we will see how that works. And of course, this means that if you have a character idea in mind that you would like to play and your dice rolls simply don't add up, in this particular edition, you can't play that class, which of course is very different today, because you can play a substandard fighter if you want to play a fighter and your values are so bad. You know, your DM might say, well, you know, maybe think about this twice. But if you do want to play this, then you're going to have a lot of disadvantages. But, you know, that might be an interesting part of role-playing. And actually, they go into this, if you have a substandard character that just barely makes the cut for a particular class, but has very low stats overall, that this could be an interesting role-playing opportunity. And they advise the DM not to let the player re-roll the character, but say you have to live with this now. Interesting concept. Again, the DM being a really imposing figure telling people what to do. But I was always wondering why these restrictions were imposed when I was playing the computer games, because they don't explain anything. Now, in this book here, I have found the result of the reasons behind it, and I will read them to you because I think they are very interesting. Page 21, a non-human world. The DM can, if he chooses, make any class available to any race. This will certainly make your players happy. But before throwing the doors open, consider the consequences. If the only special advantage humans have is given to all the races, who will want to play a human? Because humans can become anything and they can advance to any level. Why play a 20th level human paladin when you could play a 20th level elf paladin and have all of the abilities of paladins and elves? If none of the player characters are human, it is probably safe to assume that no non-player characters of any importance are human either. Your world would have no human kingdoms or human kings, emperors, or powerful wizards. It would be run by dwarves, elves, and gnomes. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but you must consider what kind of world non-humans would create. Building a believable fantasy world is a daunting task. Creating a believable alien fantasy world, which is what a world dominated by non-humans would be, is a huge challenge even for the best writers of fantasy. What would non-human families be like? What would the popular entertainment be? What would non-humans value? What would they eat? What would their governments be like? A society governed by nature-loving elves would be a very different place than a human-dominated world. It is possible that certain character classes might not even exist. Paladinhood, for example, could be a uniquely human perspective. Would elves and dwarves hold the same values of law, order, God, and community to which a paladin aspires? If you only change the image, i.e., have elven paladins behave exactly like human paladins, what you've got is the humans in funny suits syndrome. Even within the human race, there are vast cultural differences. Think how much greater these differences would be if the blood were entirely different. Also, if humans are weak, will the other races treat them with contempt? With pity? Will humans be enslaved? All things considered, humans could have a very bad time of it if, after considering all of the potential pitfalls, you decide to experiment with non-standard class selections. Do so carefully. We offer the following advice. And then, of course, follows the table that I just quoted from. So, this is interesting. And I have been thinking about this quite a lot because today there are no restrictions. When you look at the races in even modern D&D 5th edition, there are so many. And when you look at the classes, there are so many. I honestly don't know what the difference between a sorcerer and a wizard is. I would start thinking about it if I was ever to play one. But for some reason, or some of these sentiments do gel with me, because I only ever play humans. And the reason is that I find it quite difficult to actually think what being a different race is like for these very reasons, because I have known people who basically play elves, and they're just like humans that essentially love trees. But when you think about it, elves, depending on the system, but mostly elves are immortal or very, 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 very long-lived. I mean, we're talking thousands of years. Except in DSA, where they basically have essentially where they have in theory, eternal lifespan, but in practice, each elf has some kind of focus, some kind of thing that they want to achieve. And once they have achieved it, they wither within maybe even days and die. So, but if it takes them a very long time to achieve this, they could be very long-lived. That's a really odd thing, but there you have it. But if you have a race that essentially doesn't die, and when you talk about Tolkien's elves, they don't die. And when you now say, oh yeah, but Haldir died. Yeah, he dies in the movie. Haldir in the book doesn't die. And elves don't die. Elves, when their physical manifestation expires for whatever reason, they go back to the halls of Mandos, where their spirit, soul, whatever resides until, for millennia, until they get reincarnated. But then they get reincarnated into a body that is elven, but they have all of their memories and all of their spiritual information intact. So they are essentially the same person, so they do not die. But when you have this, then the outlook on everything and the way you deal with reality is very, very different. Because you have time, you have all the time in the world, and you don't need to find out everything today. You have until next millennium to find out. You don't know how certain things work? Well, you can observe for a very long time. You don't have to break things open to find out how they work. You can take your time and observe them. And I think most players don't get this. Most players don't get this because it is hard. And especially when you are into the hack and slay area that D&D in its early stages was in. It doesn't matter. Yes, you're an elf, but you behave just like Bob that you are normally, only with a sword. And interestingly enough, they touch on role-playing almost as a technique in this DM guide. And later on, I'm going to talk about Planescape, which was also for AD&D. And there they really say this Planescape thing is for people who want to role-play. Because it is important to be able to become the other. And so, in a way, some of these sentiments I understand because I know my own shortcomings. I would probably not make a very convincing dwarf because I don't know what dwarves are about except that they are short, stout, they like beer, and they mine, But, what... I mean, you can go to Bavaria and find people that are like that. Short, stout, drink a lot of beer, and maybe not mine today, but work as farmers. So it is very human. And of course, all of these races are human because they were created by human minds. So of course, every value that we have is either imbued in them, or we try to make them completely alien and different so that they may not share certain values that we have because we wanted them to be different. But what I don't buy and what I find really weird is to say, why would somebody then still be a human? Well, because it's interesting. But unless you play a min-max game, in which case it isn't, because you have none of the racial advantages. But also, this idea, this world would be so different. How can you even imagine it? You will never be able to build it. And I'm like, what now? They are telling the DM that world building is so hard that they shouldn't even try to build something that is non-human. I'm not so sure if they've ever read anything. I mean, really? Let's look at Lovecraft, one of the greatest pulp authors there ever were. Let's talk about Conan the Cimmerian. let's talk about Ursula Le Guin, or Le Guin, depending on how you want to pronounce her name. Talk about Tolkien, who basically in the Silmarillion created a world that was completely non-human because humans only came later. Talk about Dune, where you do have humans, but where you have plenty of other things. And Dune is actually quite an alien story. Talk about Alien the movie. I mean, this idea of saying you can't do that because it is so hard. Of course, we don't see things as they are. We see things as we are. And yes, everything that a human mind conceives of will be kind of seen through the lens of mankind and also even our culture. I mean, the Western culture is pretty much Christian dominated. It is dominated by Greek and Roman gods and harking back to them and what we made of them and all of those historical things that have flown into our, if you like, common consciousness. There's a reason why we still read the Greek myths, because they still resonate, you know. And of course, when you look at Asia, let's say Japan, people who really watch Japanese movies or actually try to understand Japanese anime will sometimes tell you, that's really weird. Yes, it is, because it's not our culture. It comes from a different background. So even, as they say, human culture is so vastly different. But you can still try and build a believable world. But then you also have to accept that you will have to play this in an alien way. That yes, the elves are maybe they really suck. They are terrible people who will not be able to relate to humans because humans live 80 years and then die. This is nothing that an elf can relate to. Elves don't see death. It doesn't happen to them. It doesn't happen to their loved ones because the loved one will come back. There's only one elf in Tolkien who never came back, and that was a huge problem. That was discussed by all of the gods. So it is advice that is interesting, but I don't like this apodictic idea of saying you can't do that because it's way too complicated. Yes, you can. You need the right group for it, for sure, and people have to sit down and basically say, okay, so what does this mean? But I mean, even when you think of a completely dystopian vision of our own world, a complete kind of like post-apocalyptic world where I was talking to my partner in crime and she was telling me about, I forget what it was. It's not called Ground Zero, but something, Mutant Zero or something. And basically you live in this post-apocalyptic world and you have no idea what is there. You live in the now and you know that there was something before, and you basically walk around and you find all of these artifacts in inverted commas. So basically you find, I think they found a glittery dress and some kind of evening dress, kind of glittery, and some ballroom dancing shoes, and they were like, these are artifacts. What could someone use them for? They're completely impractical. So they were trying to find out what they were about. Of course, you have to do a lot of suspension of disbelief, because we all know what dancing pumps are for. We all know what ballroom dresses are for and who would have worn them. So you kind of have to do a lot of role-playing in order to forget about this, to not make your personal knowledge the knowledge of the characters. But even that is kind of something where you live in a completely alien world. It's not because you are alien to this world. You have a long history, but all of this has been forgotten. I mean, just think about it. Around 1200 BC, the Mediterranean Greek culture was completely wiped out. The Greeks lost the ability to read and write. That's a huge thing. Just think about it. As of tomorrow, we have a very sharp decline. In 4 weeks' time, a natural catastrophe breaks out over the Western Hemisphere, and we lose the ability to read and write, let alone operate computers or the internet. You find a book, you have no idea what this is. You can see pictures if you are lucky, because most books today don't have pictures, but you see those little black and white things on the paper page, and you have no idea what this is. The pages aren't talking to you anymore. Culture has fallen silent. And then you come across all of these things and you kind of go, what is this? Because the books would have still been there. The inscriptions would have still been there. But you can't read them. And so I think this is something that you can play. And I think it's a very interesting thing. It's a little bit like Planet of the Apes, where in the end they find out, oh, this is not a different planet. They're actually back on Earth. But now it's inhabited and ruled by apes. So I find that really interesting, that this is the reason that they feel that it would be too much of a job for a DM or a group to bring such a world to life in a believable fashion. And here I would like to say, what does this mean to be believable? I think, again, you could say, if my group and I feel it's believable and if we're having fun, then I don't care if somebody else says, oh yeah, but it's not believable. It's make-believe. It's your world. Is Alice in Wonderland believable? Talking animals? I'm not so sure. I mean, no. So that was something that I found really interesting because I'd never thought about it, why this could be the case. But then there's a nice aside as well. Also, apparently, I recently came across a video log about this AD&D and also about character limits or class limits for different races. And then somebody said, oh yeah, and it's also because Gary Gygax really didn't like Tolkien. And there is a video clip of Gygax where he says it. And he thought it was kind of like, I don't know if he said dull or something, but he basically thought it was boring. So there was no action. Which isn't true, but yes, I mean, I understand why some people would think it's boring. But you know, also I think it could be because he does come from a background of like wargaming, and then he put it into the fantasy frame with his chainmail fantasy supplement. But it was really about human heroes fighting monsters. So that was something that I found really interesting, because it cleared up some questions that I had had in my mind as to why is that. Another thing about this game is that it introduced proficiencies. So we have them today as well, although I'm not so happy about the 5e proficiencies. But there you could have proficiencies, but they are optional. So you could have weapon proficiencies, and you got slots. And as you leveled up, you got more slots that you could use. And you have the weapon proficiencies, which of course are quite easy to understand. You're either proficient in a weapon or you're not, and if you're not, then you get penalties when you use this particular weapon, which I find really interesting and actually really like. The non-weapon proficiencies are a completely different kettle of fish, because they say themselves that they are kind of like mainly fluff, blah, blah, blah. And they kind of help you a little bit when you roll, but since they are optional and they're not fully fleshed out. And that's something that I really find a bit sad, because I'm a great fan of proficiencies, or whatever you want to call them, abilities, you take your pick, because I strongly believe that not everyone can do everything, and in order for a group to work, it's also not desirable that everyone can do everything. So I also have a problem with multi-classing, where then say, oh yeah, well, so now I'm a 5th level, what not, so I'm now going to take a level in mage. How? Why? You know, if you have a really, really good reason, and if you can prove to me that you can learn this somehow, unless it's, of course, magic that's invested in you. So basically, depending on the system that you're playing, in DSA, for example, you can't just decide to become a mage all of a sudden. Multiclassing doesn't exist, because you have to have this ability. It has to be given to you, and it's something that's innate. You know, not everybody has, if you want astral power. But I think in some cases a case can be made, especially when it comes to fighting, because fighting is kind of like a skill that you can, it's almost like a skill, the ability to use a certain weapon. So if you then want to take 1 level fighter or 1 level, I don't know. But even with barbarians, I would say that's not possible, because barbarian is also kind of like a culture. They have certain things that have happened to them. They, you know, but the idea that in theory everyone can do everything, or even like saying, oh yeah, well, just roll because everyone can roll a 20. Yes, the chance of rolling a 20 on a d20 is 1 in 20. Yes, everyone can roll a natural 20. However, when we look at real life, and I still want to have my games grounded in logic, not everyone can do everything. Yes, if you go into a shop and you buy a fishing rod that's fully equipped, you can put it into a body of water and hope for the best. And yes, 1 in 20 you may catch a fish. But then what to do with that fish? Because even just opening it up and taking out the innards and also the intestines, which is really important that they don't spill, because you can spoil the whole meat and then actually contract really bad diseases, is something that you can't just do on a roll of a D20, because it is a skill. You need to know what you're doing. So even there, I would say, unless you know this, unless you have a feat in this, unless you have a skill in this, you cannot do this, and I will not let you roll. And of course, there are games where you have quite a lot of skills. So if you've ever played Anima Beyond Fantasy, they have whole skill trees. It's amazing. I find it really daunting. I was completely overwhelmed, so I chose something that has no skills, that is really kind of like super basic, because I just didn't want to dive into all of this. But when you look at Midgard, for example, they have a really nice array of skills. In my mind, the 5th edition has just enough skills for me personally to feel, yes, I can scope out my character and I can build a character with certain things that they can do without bogging them down and without bogging the whole system down. DSA, Das Schwarze Auge, Dark Eye, is also quite interesting in that, because you have numerous skills, many more than 5e D&D has. And I like the way how you have different, if you like, attributes that count towards a skill. So there are some that are kind of like dexterity based, or you have some that are strength based, blah, 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 blah. And then you have 3 values, and you have to roll against each of these 3. And only if you hit each time, then are you successful. So even if you have a skill, it doesn't mean that you necessarily are successful. And it basically takes into account that a skill is made up of different components. And I mean, a lot of people who play DSA for the first time are like, oh my God, this sucks. This is so complicated. It's complex. It's a lot more complex than 5e, but it's not complicated. But it's one way of dealing with this. And I actually like the skill system of DSA, come to think of it. I think it's actually quite nice. Yeah. And here I think they were in the middle of kind of developing this, but it's basically optional. But I really like this. Another thing that they have is when it comes to advancing your character, you cannot just level up. But you have to, well, you do level up, but you have to find a trainer and you have to pay them and you have to invest time, which again costs money, because while you are training, you have to stay somewhere, you're not having any income, you're not going adventuring in order to learn your new skill. And I really like that. And that's a lot like Midgard, where they actually say, yes, you can get new abilities, but you have to find somebody who teaches them to you, and they cost money. And unless you have money, you can't do it. And I find that really interesting. And it lends a lot of naturalism to the game. And of course, if you want to improve something, because at the moment in our Midgard campaign, I have this character and she's trying to be able to meditate. And so basically, over the course of the last season, I have been rolling against her willpower to see can she actually still her mind. She's managed 2 out of the necessary 4. Once she reaches 4, she will be able, I will let her take the skill meditation, but not before. Because she hasn't worked on it. She hasn't learned how to do it. But she has somebody who teaches her how to do it. But even then, it's something that she needs to learn herself. And we can't just give her that skill. So I think that's something that but this is something you can decide in your group as well. And say, okay, how do you plan on learning this? I want to learn how to use this weapon. Oh yeah, there is somebody in your group who uses this weapon. You can talk to them. You can teach each other, things like that. And I think this is something that you can do, and I think a lot of people do that, and it means that also during downtime between adventures you have stuff to do. Another thing that I really like Or I think something that is quite different is the way they handle initiative, because initiative is actually handled by groups. So you have the enemies and then the players, and they have group initiative. Then everybody says what they're doing, and then you do it. And also it's a bit strange, well, to us, I think, and I find it a bit cumbersome, because they also talk about rounds and turns. And a round is a turn consists of 10 rounds. And in this round, in this combat round, there is a series of steps that must be followed. These are, and this is a quote, page 77, the DM decides what actions the monsters or NPCs will take, including casting spells, if any. The players indicate what their characters will do, including and casting of spells. Okay, so there's something missing, probably including actions and spells. And then you determine initiative, and then the attacks are made in order of initiative, but you do this on every single combat round. So each round you again roll for initiative. That's, And then, of course, you have modifications to those initiative rolls. So, for example, are you hasted? Are you slowed? What is the terrain? Blah, 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 blah. However, they have one thing, and I would never actually do this, because to roll initiative on every single round and to also have group initiative is something that I think... I was talking to somebody about this, and they said that they, off the top of their head, they didn't think that this was going to be great. We haven't tried, but but they have one thing that I really love, and that is weapon speed. Weapon speed is, and this also includes spells, is essentially the fact that different weapons behave differently. We know this because even today, I think, I don't know about 5th edition, but definitely in DSA, different types of ranged weapons have a loading time attached to them. So you may only be able to shoot every 3rd round if you have like one of those really big crossbows that you have to kind of like wind up, and it takes a long while. There, they extend this to every weapon. And there are weapons that have a really fast speed, so they may even reduce your initiative roll, because let's say you roll a 10, but you have a really fast weapon, which has a speed of -1, so your initiative is now 9, considering, or saying that, the lower the initiative, just for argument's sake, the better. And then you have somebody else who rolls an 8, but they have this 2-handed broad or great sword. They have an initiative of 10 now, because they get a +2 to initiative, because the weapon speed is so slow. And I had known about weapon speed for a good while from different systems, but I had never played with it. But then I played Elden Ring. And Elden Ring actually uses, they don't tell you this, but they use weapon speed. And so I'm a fighter, I use a sword, and in the beginning area you have those guards at patrol. And after a while I was pretty well able to just kill them every time I met them. And it was like, I made like sure that after a 1st or 2nd hit they were down. And then I found this huge broadsword or greatsword or whatever it's called. I really fell in love with it. So I leveled and made sure that I had all of the stats that I needed to wield it well. And then I encountered one of those guards, and they just killed me. And every single time I was like, have they leveled up? They couldn't. They shouldn't. This is not possible. Then I switched weapons. I switched back to my old sword, and I just dispatched them very handily, very quickly. Why? Because there is weapon speed. And the sword that I had newly acquired was so big and so heavy and so unwieldy and so long that actually wielding this, even if you're really good at it, takes a lot more time. So if you have a nimble creature coming towards you, they will get in a couple of hits before you are even ready to do anything. That's weapon speed. But if you have this huge weapon that does a lot of damage, and you wield it against a slow opponent, you can make most of the fact that it's so heavy that it does a lot of damage, because you get in the first hit if you prep well, because the other one is even more slow than you. And I thought, this is how weapon speed works. And I like it. I really do. I find this is a very, very intriguing rule. Because it adds realism without bogging down the system. Because you know what your weapon speed is. You say your initiative is 15. It means it slows you down. So now your initiative is 13. It makes perfect sense, and I really like it. Another thing that they have is morale. So basically, monsters have morale, and they have to do morale checks, and if they fail, then they run away. Which also exists in Midgard. It doesn't exist in 5th edition, at least I've never seen it. It certainly doesn't exist in DSA. But I really like this idea of, checking for morale. Are they still holding up? They have an agency as well. They may want to run away and live to fight another day, or live to go back to their burrows where they have a family to feed, So that's something that I really like as well. And in general, they also have something that is called system shock. When something happens to you, like for example, you are transmogrified through a spell, like, I don't know, you suddenly become something else. Somebody enchants you. You have to roll against system shock, because it could be that you don't survive this. The fact that you are altered in such an important way, or such a fundamental way, may mean that you don't survive. Also, there is no guarantee that people will be able to bring you back from the dead. And the more often you are revivified, the less likely you are to be revivified. So you roll a D100, I think, against this. So system shock is a really interesting concept to my mind. So the ability of your body to withstand huge impacts that come to you from all sides. Mainly, for example, being transmogrified, things like that. Also, of course, this, as I've already said, this is a D100. So AD&D uses different types of dice. It uses the D20, but it also uses D100. There is a lot of emphasis also on off-time activities. So and this may be something that people may find strange, because AD&D and D&D have kind of like this, it's all about fighting in dungeons and blah, blah, blah. It is. But they also spend a lot of time on what you can do between adventures, how you recuperate. And recuperation is important. You don't just go to sleep, have a long rest, and then you are fully restored. Healing is effort. Healing takes time, which I like. 5th edition with, you go to sleep and everything's fine. No. That's really one of the things that I find most grating about 5th edition. Because there is no challenge. You don't have to do resource management with regard to how do we actually go on and live to fight another day. How do we do this? And I think 5th edition is actually the only system that I know where restoration works so quickly and so easily. None of the other systems I've ever played, as far as I know, is so simple and so also unrealistic, I would say. And I think these are the main things that I actually observed that struck me. And like I said, I would really like to play an AD&D game. I hope I will be able to run one, and I will do a character creation in the next couple of weeks, hopefully before October. We'll see, to just see how it feels to create an AD&D 2nd edition character for Dark Sun. And that's all from me for today. Have a great day, a great night. Talk to you soon. Bye.